now. Okay, hello everyone and welcome to tonight's webinar on Lake Erie's disappearing shoreline. If you don't know me already, my name is Dan Marina with Long Point Basin Land Trust. And this evening, I'll be doing a quick introduction and moderating the question period at the end of the presentation. But before we get started, a couple of quick housekeeping items. So we ask that you please keep your videos off and keep your microphones muted. Please feel free to ask any questions you have that pop up during the presentation this evening. Just do so on the chat box and then we'll address the questions at the end of the presentation. As well, we'll be recording the webinar. So if you have any technical issues and you get disconnected, we will be sharing a link later on with a YouTube video so you can watch it again later. Okay, so this is the sixth webinar and the 10th Explore the Outdoors event for 2022. If you haven't already, I encourage everyone to please do check out our events page on our website to see all the other events we have lined up this year. And do please spread the word for our Explore the Outdoors program. Long Point Basin Land Trust is a charitable non-government organization with a mission to protect and restore functioning ecosystems in the Long Point Basin, which is a geographic area located in the Central Carolinian region. This is achieved through land securement, habitat restoration, research, and outreach. And to learn more about us and stay connected, we encourage everyone to visit our website, sign up to our e-newsletter, and join us on social media. Long Point Basin Land Trust currently owns and stewards 341 hectares over 13 nature reserves, and all of them are located within Norfolk County, Ontario. 7 of the nature reserves are open to the public and we are in the process of developing a formal trail system. So this will allow us to provide opportunities for people to connect with the environment through hands-on and outdoor experiences. Just want to make sure, yeah. So our next event for Explore the Outdoors this year is our annual Monarch Tagging event, which is coming up on September 10th. So if you're interested in participating in this field event, it'll be on, just go onto our website to register to get more information, or feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about that event. So tonight's speaker, Dr. Chris Hauser, is the Dean of Science and a professor in the School of the Environment at the University of Windsor. Prior to joining the University of Windsor, he was a professor at Texas A&M University and the University of West Florida. He completed his degrees at the University of Guelph and the University of Toronto and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Geological Survey of Canada. His research focuses on coastal processes and hazards in the Great Lakes, Gulf of Mexico, Prince Edward Island, and Costa Rica. And his coastal research group manages the Citizen Science COASTIE Canada program with Parks Canada. His research in the Great Lakes focuses on the past and future responses of coastal systems to the changes in lake levels, storm activity, lake ice, and shoreline management, as well as strategies to improve beach safety and reduce the number of drowning fatalities through the Smart Beach project. So with that, I'll hand it over to Chris to continue the presentation.
All right, thank you very much, Dan. I'm just going to switch my screen here to my presentation. And thank you to everyone for this opportunity to meet and to talk about some of the work that we are doing at the University of Windsor. But I want to begin by recognizing that I've been at the University of Windsor and really working on the Great Lakes for the last 6 years. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight builds on some really important work that's being done by people like Robin Davidson-Arnott, Alan Trenhale, Coakley, and Pete Zuzak, who have really helped to get us a better understanding as to what's happening within Lake Erie and the Great Lakes in general. And so, as requested, I'm focusing on Lake Erie's disappearing shoreline, but I'm going to focus using an example from Point Pelee, where the situation is getting quite desperate, quite difficult, and we really need to implement a solution now. It's not a time for continuing science. It's actually a moment that we really need to figure out how we are going to protect this really important biophysical landscape. Now, just as a background, as Dan had mentioned, I'm originally from Ontario. I grew up in Parry Sound, Huntsville, Newmarket, but then spent most of my career at the University of University of West Florida, where I did my first academic position, moved to Texas A&M University, and then ultimately to the University of Windsor in 2016. And I've been there now for the last 6 years. Now, my research is quite varied. While I'm going to be talking to you tonight about shoreline issues along the north shore of Lake Erie, a large part of it also is focused on rip currents and understanding both the physical and the social dimensions of rip currents, and which cause about 50 drownings on average per year within the Great Lakes. And understanding really what is that surf hazard within the Great Lakes and how do we do a better job of protecting beach users. And we have a program called Smart Beach that is being implemented in Kincardine in this past year. We do also a lot of work looking at beach-dune interaction, looking at how sediment moves from the near shore to the beach and ultimately to the dune. And our work there is largely focused in Prince Edward Island and looking at how the entire north shore of Prince Edward Island and Prince Edward Island National Park will respond to sea level rise and changes in storm activity. As noted by Dan, we do have a program that we run on behalf of Parks Canada called COASTIE. You can look it up at coastiecanada.ca. And in fact, I'm going to come back to this at the very end because it does represent an opportunity that we can expand this citizen science type monitoring within the Great Lakes. And University of Windsor hosts this on behalf of COASTIE International, which started in Australia. Now, since moving back to Canada, moving back to the Great Lakes, I've been very focused on understanding kind of Great Lakes shoreline erosion issues and looking at what are some of the causes and taking a more of an ecosystem management approach, which brings together the physical, the social, and the governance issues that might be controlling shoreline erosion issues and management strategies moving into the future. Now, as a kind of a standing back and looking at the Great Lakes in the north shore of Lake Erie in particular, it really has some very dominant sediment transport pathways that define what we're seeing in terms of the major erosion and accretion issues within the broad area. And obviously I'm speaking here tonight virtually in the Long Point region, in which you're at the end of two littoral cells. I'm going to be using Point Pelee as our example tonight, which is also very similar in its form. Now, part of our work also, and really when you start thinking about the littoral cells within Lake Erie, it is also about cliff retreat. These large moraine tilled cliffs that form the north shore of PEI provide an important source of sediment to many of these barrier spits that we see along the north shore, Pelee, Rondeau, and Long Point, and several of the other smaller ones along the north shore. These till cliffs formed during the glacial period provide the sediment that is moved along the shoreline and ultimately supplies these larger barrier spits that provide important ecological habitat. Now, during the last couple of years, we've seen increased water levels, storm activity, and a lack of ice conditions, which have protected those shorelines during the winter storm season. As a result, the rate of shoreline or cliff erosion and cliff retreat has began to accelerate in recent years. Now, that sediment, however, is important for these barrier spits such as Rondeau and Long Point. And so I'm using a video here from Rondeau, in which you can see the sediment that is coming from along shore further from the west is being moved along the shoreline, but ultimately is being captured by this large jetty system that protects the harbor. So it provides a very important social economic purpose as a jetty, but at the end of the day, it does kind of stop that sediment from moving along the shoreline. And as a result, parts of Rondeau are being starved of sediment, and the amount of overwash, the amount of breaching is increasing. So we're starting to see a dramatic change in the shorelines, not only because of changes in storm activity, water levels, and lake ice, but also because of the anthropogenic changes to that shoreline. And you can also see it at places such as Port Burwell. Very dramatic shift in that shoreline from where you've got this large jetty that extends out into Lake Erie, associated with the provincial park, but it does starve the areas adjacent to it further to the east. Now, in many cases, whenever we start to see erosion, we also begin to see changes in shoreline protection. People are putting in protection structures, whether it be rock walls, sheet walls, whatever. Now, these are very effective when you've got very direct, perpendicular wave attack directly to the shoreline. But much of what we see within Lake Erie and across the Great Lakes is an alongshore transport. And so while these breakwalls might protect against breaking waves, they're not really doing anything when it comes to the alongshore transport. As a result, areas where you're getting erosion are going to continue to erode regardless of whether you have a breakwall or a sheet wall. But once you put in one breakwall or sheet wall, then everywhere along that length of shoreline, that littoral cell will also be required to then put in one of those breakwalls or sheet walls. Essentially, because it's an alongshore problem, if one person puts in a sheet wall, the next person down drift is going to be starved of sediment, and so will they. And we see this along large parts of the Great Lakes shoreline, in which you are seeing protection structures being put in because they're eroding. But the moment you put in one, everywhere along that littoral cell is now required to put in something as well. Now, this is really how we set up the problem when it comes to Point Pelee. So when you look at Point Pelee National Park, in a very important ecological region, right at the Carolinian zone, it's part of the migratory bird pathway. This is an area that is undergoing and has been for decades undergoing very rapid erosion. It's an increasing rate of erosion. And really, we need to begin to solve this problem now. There's no need for further study. It's actually a problem that we need to begin resolving at this moment. Now, apologize, my screen just froze there. Looking at Point Pelee, though, Point Pelee is a historical artifact. It's an artifact of the glacial period. It actually formed on top of an old moraine, a glacial moraine. So a moraine, the best way of describing it is like a bulldozer pile. Bulldozer comes through and pushes up all this sediment. A moraine is exactly that same way. The glacier has just simply pushed a bunch of gravel, rock, sand, all into a big pile. Point Pelee formed on top of that. And so what you've got in terms of Point Pelee from the west side to the east side is this transition from a sandy, gravelly shore face with some dunes on top, a wide, broad marsh that provides the habitat for the migratory birds, and a very narrow east barrier bar that really protects that marsh from these large waves and storm events that come in from the east. Now, there's two different models for how Point Pelee formed, one by Alan Trenhill, the other one by Coakley. Both of them are fairly similar. The idea being is that the Point Pelee formed on top of this moraine. And really, as the water levels began to rise in Lake Erie, so originally the Great Lakes didn't flow from Lake Superior all the way to Lake Ontario. They used to flow out through an area near North Bay. Lake Huron was just kind of a backwater. But eventually that area around North Bay, through isostatic uplift, lifted up, and it no longer was a pathway for the water to go out to the St. Lawrence. At that moment, now you started to get the St. Clair and the Detroit River beginning to form, and Lake Erie began to fill up very quickly. It was during this time that you have all these glacial moraines, and all of a sudden Lake Erie becomes a lake. It's got this major supply of water coming down the Detroit River. It starts to fill up, and the moraine begins to shrink, but it provides the sediment for that foreland, that glacial foreland, to begin to form. And as a result, by about 1,000 years before present, you get to what is near to be the modern version of what we understand as Point Pelee. It didn't form because of sediment being drawn from the east and the west. It rather formed in place as this moraine became flooded. However, today, and this is work based on Pete Zuzek's work, looking at and understanding what's happening in the Western Basin, is that today, Point Pelee, in terms of its stability, depends upon the sediment that comes from the east and from the west. And that sediment is part of these two littoral cells that are formed around this old glacial moraine. Sediment from the west has to move from Colchester to Kingsville to Leamington and ultimately to Point Pelee, whereas the sediment from the east is moving from Alma all the way to Wheatley and ultimately around towards that Point Pelee region. So Point Pelee does not have issues today because of its modern sediment, was not formed by its modern sediment supply, but its current stability depends upon that sediment supply from the east and from the west. And so you can look at some of these locations where the sediment should be coming from. Places such as Wheatley Provincial Park. It's undergoing dramatic erosion. In fact, parts of the park are completely broken apart, and the old road that used to go around is now half into Lake Erie. But these were some of the smaller cliffs that provided sediment in towards that Point Pelee from the eastern side. But that sediment that ultimately moves from Wheatley is blocked by things such as the Wheatley Harbor. Now, the Wheatley Harbor creates a depositional zone on its eastern side, but because it's gaining sediment on the eastern side and does not allow for a large amount of sediment to move to the western side, this western side is starved and the beach is eroded. As a result, all of these cottages, all of these homes along that western side now have rock walls. As a result, they've protected their shoreline, but they've now starved the next section of shoreline. And as a result, they're beginning to erode. Again, it goes back to that idea that once you begin to protect one section of shoreline, all shorelines along the rest of that littoral cell need to ultimately be protected. And we can see a pretty dramatic example here at Hillman Marsh. Here you've got a lack of sediment coming from that Wheatley Harbor region, and the entire shoreline has now been completely rock walled. Some of the work, again, shown by Pete Zuzek, has shown that, in fact, right out in front of these rock walls, not only because they've stopped the horizontal erosion, they've now created a significant vertical erosion. So the depths of water just offshore of these rock walls are fairly substantial. It's almost a point of no return. This is at a place called Hillman Marsh. And this is one of the spots that I'm going to come back to later in this presentation that we've been looking at over the last 2 years. Once you start to starve an area, you get considerable shoreline erosion. This is the eastern shoreline of Point Pelee during just a normal fall storm that came through in 2017. As a result of that shoreline retreat, you start to get the shoreline moving backwards. So here, this section, which I'm going to refer to as East Beach in a few slides, is now eroding quite dramatically and is moving backwards through overwash. This area along this section where you've got these trees, this area here is being eroded quite substantially. The trees are falling into the water, and it eventually will become very much like this barren barrier spit in the near future. But look at the dramatic change in the shoreline configuration. Here you've got this bend in the shoreline. This is the amount to which parts of Point Pelee have been eroded because of the lack of the trees that have been eroded many decades ago. Look at this section here from the actual edge of Point Pelee. Look at how far it's moved backwards. That's because this entire section of shoreline is now rock walled. It is now deep. There's no sediment moving, or really any sediment moving along that shoreline, which means that Point Pelee is starved and will continue to be starved into the near future. Now, added on top of these changes to the shoreline have been our water levels. In recent years, we've seen record and historic water levels, particularly during 2020. But some of the work that's coming out of the University of Michigan suggests that the amount of precipitation is going to increase, but the amount of evapotranspiration is going to decrease, and that the projections from the University of Michigan suggest that water levels are going to continue to rise. Now, for the cliffs, that means you're going to have greater erosion, more sediment added into the system. But because you've already have the system that is being modified by shoreline change, now you've got this very deep section. We don't have enough sediment to fill in that gap. So we're going to get into a position of greater erosion. The other part to all this, and a large part of this work comes from Mary Louise Burney's work from Wilfrid Laurier University, is the impact of lake ice cover. Now, this is a photograph from this past winter at Point Pelee, but this is the picture of the maximum extent of lake ice. And in fact, if you look to just to the west on the left-hand side and to the east on the right-hand side, you can actually see the edges of the open water. It used to be that in the 1940s, you could drive a truck from Point Pelee, from Leamington to Cleveland. Now, it is just a couple of weeks in which Point Pelee is covered in ice. And in fact, in the recent years, we've seen more and more years where you've had a lack of ice. 2 years ago, so this picture was taken this past winter. 2 winters ago is the picture in the top right-hand corner, which shows no ice during the middle of January on the western shoreline of Point Pelee, just over here, if you could see my cursor. So we're going into a period where you're getting limited lake ice, which means that the winter storms, which typically have not impacted Point Pelee, are going to increase. Now, if you start to look at what's been happening over this region, because of these changes, the changes in water levels, the changes in shoreline kind of structures, the changes in lake ice, we're seeing a very dramatic erosion, particularly on the eastern side of Point Pelee. The western side hasn't seen as much of it. It still has some degree of sediment supply. I'll come back to that later. But the eastern side has experienced dramatic erosion and has moved back by tens of meters. Again, a large part of this work in terms of the initial monitoring comes from, again, the work that Pete Zuzek has done along the entire Lake Erie shoreline. Very dramatic changes. But what's happening as a result of that shoreline erosion is you are seeing then this overwash that is developing across some of these barren sections, the erosion of the adjacent shorelines and the loss of the tree line leading to barren barriers, but it's opening up the marsh environment. As you open up that marsh environment, you are now exposing fairly critical habitat to open water, to open waves. So one of my grad students over the last 2 years, Jenny Garrett, has been looking at how East Beach on Point Pelee has been changing and has been documenting right back from 1973 to modern times how this shoreline has changed. I'm not going to get into too much of the details, but what they have identified is that in fact the eastern shoreline has historically gone through these periods of high water levels and low water levels, of breaching and non-breaching, and you see it in the shape of the shoreline, these little kind of extended wave fan features that are both associated with overwash, but also due to this breaching. And what we're seeing is this pattern of a breach, high water levels will come in, a breach will develop, it'll expose the marsh, but because of sediment from adjacent areas, that breach will eventually close as water levels begin to fall. And so one of the things we've done over the last couple of years is monitor how these breaches are in fact recovering. And so places like East Beach, which I'm just going to go back to this photograph of, have a large amount of sediment along the adjacent shorelines. So as a result, as water levels rise, you might get a breach that moves through and opens up that marsh environment. But the adjacent shorelines provide the sediment that moves along the shoreline and eventually closes in and recovers that breach environment. So as long as you've got an adjacent sediment supply, your breach will close. And we've seen that at East Beach on Point Pelee several times. The breach will open wide, but even though water levels are high, that new sediment coming from along shore will close it. The breach will open wide, and then the sediment will close it back up. So breaching, which we've seen also in some of our geologic records, which unfortunately I didn't have an ability to prepare for tonight, also shows that breaching along this section of Point Pelee is common. It has been happening for decades to centuries, but it naturally recovers. Now, that would suggest that in fact, we don't have to worry about this. But I'm going to give you another example as we begin to look at it. This is Hillman Marsh. So Point Pelee is directly behind this picture to the south. Hillman Marsh is at the northern end of the Point Pelee foreland. Here, so as an example, the Wheatley Harbor is way up here in the top of the picture. All this is the kind of that protected shoreline of the cottages and homeowners. And this is Hillman. Look at the indentation of that shoreline. That's the amount of erosion that has occurred in this location. That's the amount of shoreline that has been lost. Hillman is also experiencing a breach just like East Beach. But unlike East Beach, which has parts of Point Pelee and to provide sediment, Hillman has got no sediment updrift. As a result, it is starved of any sediment. So doing the exact same thing, we have tracked Hillman Marsh all the way back to 1931, looking at the shoreline configurations and how that system was evolving. Through a large part of the last century, this system behaved exactly like East Beach. The water levels would rise, the breach would form, but it would then recover because of sediment from along the shoreline. At Hillman Marsh, we are not seeing that anymore. We've hit into a dire position. So what we have actually started to see is as water levels began to rise, the breach would open, but instead of closing itself off from sediment from along shore, it has actually continued to stay open despite dropping water levels. And the reason for this are these rock walls that have formed, that have been put in on the north and the south ends of this breach. So in fact, at Hillman Marsh, we have not seen recovery. And in fact, we've seen a widening of the marsh despite the fact that water levels have began to drop, which suggests that either you're going to have a major influx of new sediment, or you're going to have water levels drop dramatically, new shoreline exposed to provide the sediment. But the problem is, it's a very deep shoreline off of that spot. There's not a lot of sediment to be found. So here is an example. I apologize for the noise. Turn that down. This is a picture from last winter of Hillman Marsh. This is the breach environment. These are the waves that are now coming in to this critical habitat, which means that if this system no longer is able to recover, then this marsh habitat, this migratory bird habitat, is potentially threatened or will change quite dramatically. So we have two types of behaviors that we are starting to see. One, a more natural system which has an adequate supply of sediment, such as East Beach, in which the breach will open, but even though water levels are high, the sediment supply from along shore will close it right back up. It's a natural cycle that is happening on that shoreline. It's been happening for decades to centuries. But at Hillman, because of the lack of sediment from along the shoreline, as the water levels begin to drop, the actual barrier, the breach, is no longer recovering. So we're left with three possible scenarios. One, water levels drop dramatically, and as a result, new shoreline is exposed and the whole system will recover. Two, water levels will drop, but because of the deep water and these profiles, it won't recover. Or 3, because it's a sediment-starved area, continued starvation of that sediment will open it up even further. We're at a point now where we just can't wait. This system is in critical failure, which means that some of this critical habitat is also in this failure position. Again, it goes back to limited sediment supply. Wheatley Harbor on the eastern side is the first major sink that holds the sediment back. But it then, normally, if you've starved the sediment on one side, it will then pick it up on the other. But now you've got rock walls that are protecting that sediment, which means that you no longer have sediment moving even further. If one person is starving, the next person along that line will also starve. We see that also on the western side. We see the Kingsville Harbor, the Leamington Harbour, which are creating the sink of sediment on one side as the littoral and the kind of that current moves along the shoreline. Everywhere to the east of this is all now rock wall, hardened shoreline. It's hardened because these shorelines were eroding. If you've starved the sediment here, it's got to pick it up somewhere else. As a result, it was eroding on this other side. And if you can't get enough on one side, you have to dig a little bit deeper. So as a result, one sediment sink causes everything else along the line to fall into place. And as a result, once you put in one rock wall, one jetty, you've got to put in multiple. Now, this leads to one of the things that we're looking at right now. Can we put in nourishment? On the western shoreline, by all means, I think there's enough sediment there. And again, through Pete Zuzek's work looking at the shorelines, there's probably a good enough profile here, deep enough in terms of, shallow enough, in which sediment could be put on the western shoreline and nourishment being put back on here. A very strong structure kind of approach to this. On the eastern shoreline, it's a little more difficult. It's a little bit deeper off water. In Point Pelee, by all means, nourishment and potentially some rock wall structures further offshore that limit the amount of wave activity most likely represent the most immediate and needed solution to protect this shoreline from eroding further. Part of that sediment could come from the shoal. And again, this is Pete Zuzek's work, looking at where the sediment ultimately goes. And we have a student coming in this year to do the modeling of how sediment moves along this shoreline and eventually ends up in these large shoals. Could these shoals be the supply of sediment that is then brought back to the top of the spit and or the foreland, work their way back down, and then brought back up, just like a conveyor belt? I think this is the solution that needs to be brought in forward immediately. And then again, Pete's really highlighted this over many years of working within this region. There is immediate need to start working on a solution like this right now. We just don't know where is the modern sediment going. And so it's about refining some of the science that we have behind it. The question then comes down to Hillman Marsh, this area that is so sediment starved that in fact, we aren't even seeing the breach recovering anymore. Is it possible? And the answer is probably no. It is so deep of a profile that the amount of sediment is probably not economically viable. It is here that we're probably going to need a more engineered solution with rock walls offshore to protect this shoreline from erosion. This is something that is not within my particular area. We monitor what's happening, but really we're at a point that this critical habitat for migratory birds needs to be solved sooner than later. So this really represents an opportunity to look at Lake Erie. We're at a precipice right now, really at an important point where we need to start implementing solutions to protect that shoreline from further erosion. And it's going to be the same here at Point Pelee, to Rondeau, to Long Point, and anywhere else along that shoreline. We've got to start thinking about these solutions immediately. Now, at the very beginning, I did identify something called COASTIE, and Dan also mentioned it. This is a program that we are as part of COSTAP it's a global program started in Australia. COASTIE is the Parks Canada branded version of COSNAP. We are implementing COSNAP Canada throughout the Great Lakes. And so, in fact, it's an opportunity, an invitation to this group, to anybody along the Great Lakes, to participate in COSNAP Canada to help us monitor shoreline change, dune erosion, rip currents and surf activity, beach user activity or ice cover and timing, or volcano development, and ultimately to help us better understand the rates at which this erosion is occurring. This is a picture from Prince Edward Island, but you can imagine a very similar picture from Long Point and the dunes there. Can we use citizen science monitoring to begin monitoring how that beach dune system is eroding and what we might need to do to begin resolving that rate of erosion? So I wanted to end this with a quick invitation for this group to join COSNAP Canada as we expand within the Great Lakes region to begin monitoring coastal change on a regular basis. And Dan, with that, I'm going to pass it back to you for any type of questions that you might have, that people might have.
Great, thank you, Chris. That was a really interesting presentation. It's incredible how complicating these shoreline processes are, and it makes you wonder all the things that we've done to kind of alter the shoreline and how it's having that kind of cascading effect downstream, or I guess down the coast or whatever. But yeah, so if anyone has any questions, feel free now to type them out in our chat window. I have one quick question for you, Chris. Just thinking in terms of seeing all of the effects that this is all causing, having all this infrastructure, is there any sort of regulations you think that are going to be put in place to keep people from installing more breaks and causing the problems elsewhere? Or
that's a really tough one. We've got a very distributed kind of regulatory framework in Ontario as to how to deal with protected shorelines. And again, one person might put in one, but the moment you're the downdrift end of that, you're going to have to put in one of yourself because you're now starved of sediment. But we've got a very distributed framework from conservation authorities to the province to the federal government and how we're managing shorelines. And so I don't think there's one regulatory piece, but also the Lake Erie shoreline is quite complicated. So each region is slightly different in what might need to happen. And that's where, again, the conservation authorities will come into it. And so this is one of the problems that we have, and it goes to, I guess, Joe's question there, who governs the Lake Erie shoreline, is the fact that it's too distributed at this moment, that we really don't have distributed in space and distributed across the three different levels, that we really don't have a strong program. Now, I know, again, Pete Zuzak's been working with Environment Canada, looking at a broader regional program in terms of for Lake Erie, but I haven't seen the final results of that one. But I think that really comes down to what we need is a broader strategy for the entire region. I can
question from Sandy here, sir. I'll just quickly ask it. Would multiple jetties slow erosion and or capture sediment?
They will. So a jetty is a large one that is for a kind of entrance to a harbor. So a groin is the smaller one that you would potentially put on your property. In fact, it will then slow the erosion of the alongshore transport. So it does not protect against high water levels, big storm activity coming through. But what it's doing is any deficit of sediment along the shoreline, that's where, in fact, these groins and jetties do provide the protection. But the problem is that once one person puts one in, the next person down line has to put in one, and then it keeps going down the line. So it's one of those, yes, it does, but once you put it in, the entire littoral cell has to adopt to that particular measure.
Interesting. Question from Liv. Is there any way to restore or remove rock walls once they've been installed?
they can be removed and restored, but what you're going to see is, particularly where they've been in place for a large number of years, and you've got very deep erosion vertically, you're going to see a considerable collapse of the shoreline that will also cause a horizontal movement, a massive retreat. So yes, by all means, they can be removed, but you're going to see the consequences of decades of those rock walls being put in place. What I didn't tell you about some of the areas just to the north of Pelee is that they sit on top of levees. So these cottages are on top of levees, and their rock walls protect that levee. If it wasn't for that levee, you would have a massive flood of water across some very valuable farmland. So it's at a point where, from a socioeconomic standpoint, from a governance standpoint, that is not a viable solution.
Interesting. A question from Brad. Is there a regional erosion model that is consulted when applications are made for construction along the shoreline?
That I cannot answer. That is something that you would have to look at to what your local conservation authority and other regulatory agencies are using to define their areas. But not all agencies, not all regulatory authorities are at the same level of terms of their modeling of shorelines.
I see. Well, great. That was another one came in. Just a great thank you from Pete there. Asking if you can say something about the role of managed retreat to deal with erosion.
Managed retreat goes back to the question about that Liv had about removing some of these rock walls and some of these structures. In fact, managed retreat is the one way in which we start adding sediment back to the system, but making sure that it doesn't come at the expense of property owners, or at least they have the ability to adjust to it. It does add sediment back into the system. Is it enough, and is that the only solution, or is it an important starting point?
Question from Val. Is sheet piling also an issue?
Sheet piling is just very much like a rock wall in terms of you're putting in this vertical structure. We tend to think of erosion because we see it during big storms of waves coming in and crashing onto the shoreline. Yes, that is very violent. That does a lot of damage in that moment. But a large amount of the erosion, particularly on the north shore of Lake Erie, is caused by the alongshore current. You're moving sediment along, and if you have more money, if you have more sand coming in, I'm thinking of a bank account now. If you got more coming in than going out, you're making a deposition. But if you have less coming in than going out, you've got an erosion of that supply. So as a result, these sheet walls do the exact same thing. They protect against the cross shore, the waves hitting on it. They don't protect against the alongshore. And as a result, rock walls, sheet pilings, they eventually do fail as that area vertically erodes down. This goes back to this idea of managed retreat. Maybe we need to actually be allowing that sediment back into the system.
Val had just a quick follow-up question to that. People think they're doing the right thing with rock walls and sheet piling, but how do we change their thinking?
It's a great question, and I don't have an answer to that by any means. If I was a property owner along the North Shore, and I wish I was, but if I was a property owner along the North Shore, I would be doing everything I could to protect my property. So it's one of those hard ones where you've got to think about it from a kind of a broader littoral cell. How do you make sure that because again, one person in that littoral cell starting the rock wall, starting the sheet pile, has everybody now doing it. It's about more of a community-based program. And there's some really good work done in North Carolina about how it's not an individual property owner that makes the difference. It's the community within the littoral cell that can really make that difference.
Question from James. I believe you referenced something called Coast Map at the end, and he's asking how it works.
So I'm just going to put my slide back up here.
Okay, I'll stop sharing there.
Not a problem.
Yep.
So this is called Coast Snap. You might have seen it if you visited the Maritimes, if you visited Point Pelee. It's a little stand where you put your phone directly into the stand and you take the same photograph that every other person who's been to that beach has taken. For the last, we put this in Parks Canada across about 12 different sites back in October. And right now we have about 2,000 photographs of the beaches. We're able to track shoreline change, dune erosion. We've captured events that we physically could not be in Prince Edward Island for, and we've captured major dune erosion events. COASTNAP, what we're looking for is people who are willing to host on their property, municipalities, parks, to implement these coastal stands. They're metal stands that we help you with the design of them, put them in there. We do all of the data collection, the data analysis, and we provide it right back to whatever organization that is. So Parks Canada in real time has our data. If you, in fact, you want to look at what COASTNAP is, you can, I encourage you to go visit our COASTIE site, coastiecanada.ca. You can go there, and in fact, you can look at the 25 most recent photographs that were taken just today of different beaches from parks, different national parks within the Maritimes in Ontario.
Cool.
So if you're interested in this program and would like to kind of consider being part of it, I'm just going to, didn't think of putting this earlier, but here is my email. Oh, not Chooser. It's chowser@uwindsor.ca. If you're interested in COASTIE or COASTNAP and implementing it, helping us implement it throughout the Great Lakes, please contact me directly on this email, and I'll put it directly in the chat as well.
Excellent. Just have a comment here from Jody. I think a collective approach would help, and there are multiple values, ecological, social, and economic, that need considering, including the property impacts. People need to be part of developing the solution. So kind of going back to that community approach, I think, right?
That's exactly it. It's called ecosystem management, in which you don't, it's not just about understanding the physical processes, but also understanding that people live along the coastline. People have different values of the coastline. We want to be part of the coast. So how do we do this in a way that makes sure that we protect this resource, but also recognize how important it is?
Mm-hmm. Well, if anyone has any last minute burning questions, I think that might be it. But thanks again. That was an excellent presentation. I found it very informative. And I mean, all of those principles apply to what we're experiencing down in Long Point as well. So, you know, something to consider.
Yeah, and so again, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any further follow-up questions or would like to be part of the COASTNAP program.